Welcome back to What You Will Learn. My name is Adam Ashton.
And my name is Adam Jones. Today we're taking you through the best bits of What the Dogs Saw by Malcolm Gladwell.
We haven't got enough Malcolm Gladwell in the feed. It's been way too long. He was a history graduate from the University of Toronto. He got to the point where he'd finished his undergraduate, but his grades weren't good enough to stay on for any postgrad work. He'd actually been rejected by more than a dozen advertising agencies. He sent out a few applications for fellowships. He wanted to go somewhere exotic. All of those went nowhere, got a bunch of rejections. He was pretty much left to one thing, and that was writing. But lucky for Big Malk, he was pretty good.
He is a good writer, and because of that, his journalistic trajectory was pretty wild and a story within itself. He went from some bit of a no-name Indian-based American Spectator to the doors of the New Yorker, which is obviously a huge magazine. And over time, he established himself as one of the most imaginative non-fiction writers really of all time.
He'd effectively trademarked himself by owning this brand of social psychology, something that he'd honed over decades working at this magazine. He had this confident, optimistic pieces. He talked about geniuses. He talked about multinational corporations. He talked about the quirks of human behavior. And he really tied them all together through this style that's become pretty trademark Gladwellian style, and plenty of other authors replicate and rip off.
Yeah, 100%. What he's really good at, he points out all the truths that are just simply under our noses. And this, I've had a bit of a dig at him in past episodes for that, but it is actually true. It is a real skill to point out obvious truths and use stories in a very clever way to be able to point them out.
Yeah, so that's sort of what he does. He takes an idea, he recasts it as a human story, he works through it all the way to this natural conclusion, revealing different pieces of the puzzle along the way and taking strips off conventional wisdom as he goes. He says that his pieces are meant to be like little adventures.
Which they are. And in this book, What the Dogs Saw, what he's done is bundled together his favourite articles from the New Yorker since he joined them as a young writer. And the place where he went from nobody to being the Gladwellian master that
Admittedly,
we know him as today.
This is probably like a good bit of a cash grab. If I was to give a bit of a dig, it's like he'd written 3 massive bestsellers, The Tipping Point, Blink, Outliers, and then the publishers come to him and say, hey, you've got all these articles, do you want to whip a couple together and we'll sell it for $20 each? And that's really all he's done is put his different articles together.
Well, he duped us, didn't he?
So what we've done is we've picked out our favourites. We're going to look at 2 different types of failure. We're going to look at choking and we're going to look at panicking. Next, we're going to look at 2 different types of geniuses. We're going to look at prodigies versus late bloomers. And then we're going to look at 2 different types of secrets, puzzles versus mysteries.
It's the 1993 Wimbledon final and it's the third and final set. We have Jana Novotná. She's leading 4-1 and serving 40-30. She's only 1 point away from winning the game. It's the biggest match of her life. And effectively, she's 1 point from winning this game and only 5 points off claiming the most coveted championship in tennis and the biggest match and prize of her life. So now she's standing poised and confident, going through her usual routine, bouncing the ball a couple of times, lobs the ball up to serve, and then she yanks it too hard and then the ball went into the net. She goes again on her second serve. And visually, it's much worse. The ball toss, the arch of the back, the power, it's all slumped. And what she's done is double faulted. Now it's 40-40 juice.
On the next point, she served okay, but when she was playing Steffi Graf, she popped it back too high. Novotná ran in, but she missed her volley straight into the net, so it's advantage Graf. And then at game point, she's cooked it again, and she's lost this game. So all of a sudden, if she had have just won that 1 more point, she would have been leading 5-3, only a game away from winning her Wimbledon title. Now it's 4-2. It's psychologically a lot closer. Steffi Graf's turn to serve. She wins easily. Now it's 4-3. It's Novotná's next serving game. She actually double faulted 3 times and then she hit a forehand very wide and lost this game. And now it's 4-4. A very different proposition now, sitting at 4-4 at a very tight battle.
And it's all fallen apart for Novotná here. Steffi Graf made really quick work of her in the next 2 games, coming back from a 1-4 down to winning the set 6-4 and in the end claiming victory and hoisting the Wimbledon Championship Cup right in the air. And obviously Novotná's pretty upset with herself.
So what happened? We've got this person who's at the top of their game. They're leading. They've been performing strongly the whole game. And all of a sudden, she just completely falls to pieces. Did she suddenly realize how close she was to victory and she got nervous? Did she suddenly realize she'd never won a tournament before? Did she suddenly realize she was playing Steffi Graf, who was the greatest tennis player of her generation? She'd been ranked number 1 for 377 weeks in a row. What happened here?
Yeah, we've seen all kinds of choking examples. I remember the grand final of the Australian Football League about, 5 or 6 years ago when St Kilda was in it. So this is the leading sport in Australia. I remember a player, Stephen Milne, he was our best goal scorer and he had a kick-ass year. But in this grand final, he was running with the ball into an open goal, I remember, and he kind of just stumbled. He forgot how to run and missed the ball. And it was like 3 or 4 times he did that. And it was a classic example of choking.
Yeah. No, even Nick Riewoldt, the captain, who was the superstar of the sport at the time, he was in all this space, waltzed into goal, but he took it so casually and someone came and smothered it and very quickly went from 6 points to 1.
So in these examples, like Novotny here playing tennis, she's almost unrecognizable, right? Like if you saw her the day before playing around, hitting the ball, she's like the most elite tennis player on the planet. But here at the very end, when she's choking, she looks like a beginner and she's just missing the simplest of shots. So basically the same level as you and me, Asho. Or maybe not that far, but pretty bad.
Yeah, I don't know if I was ever quite at her level. Even still, I think she was a few steps above me. But what this article looks at is, pilots crash, scuba divers drown, or people make simple mistakes all the time. These professionals that you think are at the top of their field make simple mistakes. Under the glare of the pressure, the basketball player is going to miss the easy free throw. The golfer, he's going to be 3 foot away from sinking that putt and he misses it completely. In sports, we say that they choked or they panicked. We use them interchangeably, but Gladwell says that choking and panicking are actually 2 very different things.
So to understand the difference between choking and panicking, we need to look at the 2 different types of learning. And the first is explicit. So if you think about tennis, just before you start, what you do is you're told how to hold the racket, where to stand, how to move left to right. And as you're doing that, your brain is kind of running through the motions and you're really thinking quite carefully and consciously about how you do it. So that's explicit learning.
So every time you hit the ball, you're thinking about the angle of the racket. You're thinking about how hard you have to hit it to get it onto the other side of the court. You don't want to hit it too soft. You don't want to hit it too hard. You got to think how much spin do you put on it? How far back do you swing? You're thinking of all these things. It's almost like thinking fast and slow. It's like system 2, slow thinking. You're very actively, very consciously thinking about all of the things that you need to do in this type of explicit learning.
But after you've played a few years and you've hit thousands of shots, all of a sudden it's no longer explicit learning. You're not thinking about the top spin and the moving and the racket and everything like that. You're just hitting the ball and everything just goes into implicit, or using thinking fast and slow. It moves into that system 1 territory and it's unconscious, all your movements and things you do.
That's it. Your body has worked out how much force do you need, how much angle do you need, how much twist do you need. At the start, you're thinking very actively about how do you hit the ball, but at the point where you become this sort of professional level, you're just thinking, okay, the ball comes and I hit it. If someone asks you how do you hit a forehand, you just say you just swing and you just hit it, because your body knows exactly what to do.
So to make it to the top of your field, and especially the Wimbledon final, obviously you need to be someone who's been practicing tennis your whole life, just like Jana Novotny here. Intellectually, when she was younger, she knew how to hit the ball and hold the racket and everything, and she'd been through all that explicit learning. And she'd also hit the ball thousands and thousands of times to the point where it turned into implicit and she just did things automatically.
So what happens when you're a professional at this level? You're in the middle of a game, you're in flow, you're running purely on implicit learning. You're not thinking about the technicalities of how to hit the ball. You're just thinking, there's a ball, I'm going to go hit it to the other side. It's implicit. You're running purely on this implicit system. But when the stress kicks in, what happens is under the pressure, your explicit systems can creep in and start to take over. So when the pressure had kicked in, she double faulted, the game was getting tighter, she was starting to think too much. She'd lost her fluidity, she'd lost her flow, she'd lost her touch, she was double faulting, she was missing easy shots. All the things that she would normally be doing implicitly, she was thinking about exactly how she had to do it. She effectively reverted to being a beginner, and she was thinking too hard about the technicalities of how to hit simple shots.
Yeah, she'd lost that subconscious flow, and she thought that the way out was just thinking her way out and trying harder and trying harder. But as soon as you get in your brain, you lose those thousands and thousands of hits, and you just go back to when you were a kid hitting the ball around back into explicit mode. So that is choking.
Yeah, that's choking. That's lining up in footy in front of goal. If you just, casually walk in and kick the ball, you're on implicit. It goes pretty straight. If you're thinking, oh my God, the siren's just gone. We're 3 points down. I need to kick this so we can win. The crowd's half the crowd's cheering, half the crowd's booing. I got blokes yelling at me. I need to kick this perfectly. I need to drop the ball perfectly straight. I need to swing my leg back perfectly. I need to have the right amount of steps. The more you think about the technicalities, the more you're going to shank it and miss.
Yeah, and if you, in the case of Stephen Bloody Milne, if you forget how to run, you just trip over your own bloody shoelace.
That's it. So that's choking when we're thinking too hard. But panicking is something entirely different. And Gladwell brings in a different story here. He talks about some NASA specialists who were doing some scuba diving training. What they wanted to do was, in case you go off in a spaceship and it crashes, then you need to learn how to operate underwater.
Link that to me, mate. Explain that to me.
Okay, they would. I don't know what they were doing, but they need to learn how to scuba dive. I don't know why NASA actually, that's a good question. Why do NASA trainers?
Public money, mate. And they're having a big party and doing a lot of fun stuff.
Do you reckon SpaceX pilots are going down underwater?
Don't think so.
Well, so we've got this. We've got Sophie. She was 19 at the time. She was doing a open water diving certification. They've been doing it for 2 weeks. And this was their first dive where they went out into the open water without an instructor. It was just her and her buddy. It was a very, very straightforward, simple exercise. What you do is you go down, you adjust your gear so you stay stationary, and then what you do, you've got 2 regulators. That's a bit where you breathe through. You've got your main one, you've got a spare one clipped to your vest. And when you first go underwater, you need to test them both, make sure they're both working. So first, you check your regular one. If that's working, that's great. Then when you go down, you take out your main regulator, you grab your spare one, you put it in your mouth, you exhale to blow any excess water out, and then you start breathing normally. So it's a very simple routine thing. Then you switch back to your main regulator, you give the okay, you give the all clear, and you're ready to go diving.
So when Sophie was doing this exercise, she unclipped her spare, took her main regulator out of her mouth, put in the spare, then exhaled to clear the line. Then she breathed in, she gulped a whole bunch of seawater, and obviously you're all the way down at the bottom of the ocean, so you're getting a little bit worried here, but she tried to remain calm. And she tried to exhale again to clear the water out of the tube, but something clicked and the hose must have come out of the tank or something. So she started gushing out of the regulator and bubbling in her face. And Sophie here, she's panicking.
Yeah, that's a big panic. You're 40 feet underwater. You can't get back to the surface in time. Every time you breathe, you're sucking in water. You can't get any air. All you're thinking is get air. You revert to this primitive biological drives where you just need to get the absolute basics, and that's to breathe.
So Sophie, she's got her buddy there just breathing away, having a good time underwater here, and her brain's going, get some fucking air, Sophie. So Sophie, she went for that, went to grab her buddy's air. Obviously, morality's out the window when your brain's just taken over like that. And then at some moment she realised, all right, she stopped trying to take the buddy, and then the buddy came and helped out and put the air back in her mouth, and the problem was solved.
Yeah. It was quite a simple thing, but what this panic does is it wipes out your short-term memory. So Sophie, she'd taken her main regulator out, and her spare regulator was the one that wasn't working, and she'd also seen her buddy do the exact test. So what she's got is her main one, she could have just taken that and put that back in her mouth and it would have been fine. Or she just saw that her buddy had done the test and her spare one worked fine, so she could have grabbed her buddy's spare one. But because of this perceptual narrowing, because the panic has taken over, all she thought was, my buddy's breathing, I'm going to rip that one out of her mouth. So there was basically 4 regulators underwater. One didn't work, so she tried to rip her mates out instead of just going for one of the ones that was just floating around spare.
So panicking is a very conventional failure. It's something that we can understand pretty easily. In the case of Sophie, if she just had another couple of years training or been through that situation a few more times, it's very unlikely that she'd have that same response. This really fits in with what we believe in the world. Performance ought to increase with experience. The more you try something, the more likely you are to get better at it with deliberate practice.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we think that anytime somebody fails, all they need to do is go back and do more practice. But choking, that hardly makes any sense at all. You've got Novotná. She's at the top of her field. She's one of the top 2 tennis players at the time. She's got all the experience. You might think the only way for her to get better is to go back to the practice courts and keep practicing serving, but that's not really going to help her. She's been doing that for the last 20 years.
So the problem is that we always assume that the type of failures are the same, and we assume that they're all based on panic. And because of that, the prescription or the solution, it's always just to go out there and buckle down and work harder. But it's not really going to help. Novotná, she's already put in all the work, and another 10,000 hours isn't going to do anything for her.
Yeah, exactly. The pressure that comes with a Wimbledon final, or maybe for you, if it's, you've been studying for a whole year and you get to the end of year exams and you start to choke and you're not performing as well, just going back and studying more isn't going to help. What it really comes down to is an ability to cope with the pressure. The pressure is always going to be there. Anything you care deeply about, whether that's winning the Wimbledon final or passing that end of year exam, the pressure is going to be there. And if you let that pressure take over and you start to choke and you start to revert back to your explicit systems, that's when you can fail. And that's when practice isn't actually going to help you overcome it.
So choking is about thinking too much. Panic is about thinking too little. Choking is about loss of instinct. And panic is reversion to this instinct. So it's kind of good news if you're a panicker because you can go out there and try harder. But Gladwell here, if you're a choker, there's no real solution, is there? It's just
Bad luck.
You're on your own. You're cooked.
When we think about geniuses, the popular conception is that it's inextricably linked with this natural, innate talent. We think that doing something truly creative, we need this freshness and exuberance and this energy of youth. Think of some of the famous examples. Orson Welles' masterpiece, Citizen Kane, he wrote that when he was 25. You got Herman Melville, he wrote a book every year throughout his 20s, and he capped it off with Moby Dick at age 32. You got Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, he wrote this breakthrough piano concerto number 9 in E-flat major, one of Jonesy's favourites. He was only 21 when he wrote that.
And researchers agree with this hypothesis. Youth is a massive advantage. There was this creativity researcher from the pub, James Kaufman. He said, poets peak young. Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, the author of Flow, he agrees. He said, the most creative lyric verse is believed to be written in the young. And Howard Gardner, this Harvard creative expert, he said that lyric poetry is a domain where talent is discovered early, burns brightly, and then peters out at an early age.
Yeah, so they're saying that in poetry specifically, all these researchers, they said that youth is the massive, massive advantage in poetry. But then a different study looked at, he found your T.S. Eliot, your Sylvia Plath, your Robert Frost. They looked through all of the most important poems of all time. And of those top 10 poems, they looked at their ages. One was 23, one was 28. That's pretty solid. That's pretty young. But then you got 41, 42, 59. So this stat doesn't really support the hypothesis that youth is necessarily a massive advantage.
Yeah, a lot of researchers cop it in a lot of the books we do, actually. A lot of it, they claim one thing and then there's research that goes out and takes it down. So I think there's a whole bunch of confirmation bias out there, which is unavoidable.
Very much so. Now, there's one good study. I reckon that it's probably straddled both worlds pretty well. It's called Old Masters and Young Geniuses, the two life cycles of artistic creativity. So he says that you've got your young ones, the ones we listed off, the Orson Welles, the Herman Melville, they're your young ones at age 25. But on the other hand, you've got, say, like an Alfred Hitchcock who's whipping out Psycho at age 55, 61, 63. He went through all of his massive ones later in life. You've got your Mark Twain ripping out Huckleberry Finn at 49. You got Robinson Crusoe. The author was 58 at the time. So this study was saying that you've got either the ones who start early and start strong, but then you've also got the legends who come later in life.
So the perfect personification of these two ideas of the old master and young genius is Picasso and Cézanne. So I don't know who Cézanne is. Sounds like a pretty good painter, I think we're about to find out. But Picasso, he's really the classic prodigy. His first masterpiece popped out at the age of 20, and he went on a wild tear, pumping out all sorts of just wild art that still hold huge value today by the age of 26. So, he fits this stereotype perfectly. Cézanne, he was quite the opposite. He didn't at all at the very start. In the Musée d'Orsay, the greatest collection of Cézannes in the world, all of his most famous works came at the end of his career.
It was an interesting economic study that they found that the average Picasso painting that he painted in his mid-20s was worth 4 times more than a painting Picasso did in his 60s. But for Cézanne, it was actually the opposite. His paintings he did in his 60s was worth 15 times more than any painting he'd done in his 20s. So there was this freshness and exuberance of youth that meant everything to Picasso, but absolutely worked the other way for Cézanne.
Cézanne here, he's a late bloomer. We know all about the prodigies and the geniuses like the Picassos just kicking ass when they're young. But for some reason, our society kind of forgets about the account of the Cézannes, the late bloomers of the world who took a long time to bloom.
To dig a little deeper to try to work out the difference between a prodigy, an early genius, and an old master, a late genius, a late bloomer, we need to look at the two different approaches to creativity. If you look at Picasso, he can be what we label as a conceptual approach. Picasso, he always have a clear idea of what he wanted to do, and then he went and executed his vision. Picasso, he once said, "I can hardly understand the importance given to the word research. In my opinion, search means nothing. It's all about finding. I never use trials or experiments or research. I know what I want to paint, and then I paint it."
Late bloomers take the opposite approach. They go down open-ended exploration rabbit holes. Their goals are imprecise, so their procedure is tentative and incremental. So for them, it's all about experimentation. You try something, and then the next time you have a crack at it, you experiment a little and try a little bit better. You do that over and over and over, and eventually your stuff ends up somewhere much better.
So a classic example is Cézanne. He was painting a portrait of this bloke, Gustave Jeffrey. Don't know who he is, but he was getting a portrait made of him, so he must have been someone special. What Cézanne did, he made him come over the course of 3 months for 80 times. Big Gustave had to sit in this rickety old chair while Cézanne was doing more and more different versions of painting him, trying to get the nose perfect, trying to get the ears perfect. He'd make him come at 8 a.m. in the morning, sit there on this stool until 11:30 at night without a break. And then eventually Cézanne, by the end of the 80th time, he thought, "This is cooked. I'm done." Just took a knife, slashed the canvas in half and said, "Gustave, sorry, mate, this ain't happening."
Oh, mate. Gustave's what? He's invested a lot of time in there. And being an important dude, you'd be pretty pissed off.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But that's like the open-ended exploration. It takes a long time to get there. Sometimes you never even get there.
Mark Twain was the same. He followed his trial and error. His routine procedure seems to have been to start with a novel and some kind of structural plan, and eventually he'd think that's defective. So he create a new plot and overcome the previous difficulty, rewrite it again, and he'd just go through this rewrite, rewrite. And after a very long time, he'd land on something that was a little bit golden.
So the Cézannes and the Mark Twains of the late bloomer world, their results, or their lack of early results, I guess, it's not due to any defect in character or distraction or lack of ambition. It wasn't they were just floating around, going to pubs, trying to pick up girls or boys. They weren't doing any of this crazy stuff, going overseas, going wild. They were working very, very hard, and it was actually just that their version of creativity, their version of trial and error was necessary, and it took a long time to ever come to fruition.
So we often think that late bloomer means late starter. We figure that someone who rocks up on the scene later, like Cézanne and Twainy, they were probably doing something else at the very start and they switched. And we assume that if they started this new path earlier, then they'd achieve the same success much earlier. But this isn't always true. Cézanne, he actually started painting from the exact same age as Picasso. And we just think he discovered it later. We think that we're always good. And they were just hanging out on the fringes and it took a while until they were discovered. But it's not true. It turns out that they were just trying all along the whole time, and it just turned out that their success came late in their careers in that one field.
Yeah, that's it. Just because they were a late bloomer, it doesn't mean they started later. It doesn't mean that they were always good, but no one knew about them. There's a story here where Cézanne did this painting called The Banquet when he was age 21. Art critics, basically, I don't know what their fancy art word was, but basically they said, this is a piece of shit. And so it wasn't that Cézanne was just floating around doing nothing. He was actually trying really hard. He was actually just not any good when he was younger in life. And I think it probably ties into, like, if you Google Picasso and if you Google Cézanne, you can see two very different styles of paintings. You got Picasso, which is very original, very unique, all this abstract, weird blotches of stuff going all over this. You got a bloke's face. It doesn't look like anything like a bloke's face. It's very unique, very different. Whereas Cézanne is like picture perfect. It literally looks like a photograph. And you can sort of tell that, well, obviously one's going to take a lot more time to develop that kind of skill.
Yeah. Another interpretation is that Picasso just threw paint on a... Have you seen some of those ones?
It's like pretty wild, aren't they?
Basically just throwing paint on a wall and whipping out a good narrative about it and just saying it's the tit of the East European tiger or something. And all of a sudden you're selling it for a lot more than it's worth.
Exactly. He did pretty well, the old Picasso, with some stuff that looks like a 3-year-old could have done potentially. But the punchline here, I guess, is that some geniuses, our young prodigies, they're the types that know exactly what they should do and then they go and do it. But some geniuses, actually the late bloomers, they come from trialing, they come from failing, they come from writing, rewriting, abandoning, starting again, trying something different altogether. And along this road, they actually look like a failure until they get good.
At the time of writing in 2006, Osama bin Laden's whereabouts was a puzzle. The US couldn't find him because they didn't have enough information. There was a simple answer. Obviously, he's just hanging out at a place at a specific time, and all you needed to have was just enough pieces of the puzzle to put it all together, and eventually you could work out the answer. So the key to finding bin Laden would have come from getting an extra piece of information from somebody on the inside.
If you contrast that to what would happen after Saddam Hussein was overthrown, and again, obviously this is 2006, so power of hindsight, we'd probably work it out. But at the time, this was a mystery. There was no simple factual answer. It involved judgment, assessments, predictions, estimations, theories, hypotheses. It was a mystery. Ultimately, no one knew the clear answer, and all it came down to was, what did you think was going to happen?
Now, puzzles are hard to solve when there's not enough information. You just need to go out there, find information, and you'll get the answer. Mysteries, on the other hand, they're hard to solve when there's too much information.
So the distinction between a puzzle and a mystery, it's not a trivial one. Let's look at, say, September 11 as a big secret that we have to try and unlock. If you treated September 11 as a puzzle that could have been solved, then your response is to increase the amount of intelligence you get. You get more spies, you try to send a few more people undercover on the inside and try to gather as much information as possible because you think that every new piece of the puzzle makes the solution clearer. But if you treated September 11 as a mystery, then adding more information doesn't necessarily help. It all comes down to the quality of the synthesis and the analysis of that information.
So this leads us into one of the most well-known company collapses in history, and that's the story of Enron. You might have seen the documentary, The Smartest Guys in the Room. I think it's on Netflix or something, which documents it really well. But if you look at history's narrative of it, this is what Wikipedia says about Jeffrey Skilling, who was the CEO. He developed a staff of executives that by using accounting loopholes, special purpose entities, and poor financial reporting, they were able to hide billions of dollars in debt from failed deals and projects.
So that's the Wikipedia explanation, and poor, or maybe not poor Jeffrey Skilling, but Jeffrey Skilling copped 292 months in prison. That's 24 years. His lawyer didn't try to fight it. All he pled for was leniency. He says if you reduce this by 10 months, it means that he can go to a low security facility. But the judge said, sorry, mate, I'm throwing you, your little white collar crime. We're throwing you in with the rapists and the gangsters and the murderers in the high security prison for the next 24 years. So good luck,
mate. I think a big white collar bloke like Jeffrey there, wouldn't have been a good time he wouldn't have been able to defend himself. I don't think. Let's put it that way.
I don't think so.
So if you sat through the trial of Jeffrey Skilling, you would come out of it thinking that they're just trying to solve a puzzle. The prosecution said that the company had conducted shady side deals and no one really quite understood them. The executives were accused of withholding all their information from the shareholders. And they looked at Skilling. He said, he's a liar, he's a thief, he's a drunk, and he's the one to blame for obscuring all this vital information that the shareholders should have had.
The central assumption from the prosecution is just saying, hey, we were not told enough. If we had more information, this could have been avoided. But Big Gladwell says the prosecutor is wrong. Enron was not a puzzle. It couldn't have benefited from more information. All the information was there. It was actually the analysis that was wrong. Enron was a mystery.
The first element that made Enron a mystery was their accounting system. So they used something called a mark-to-market, which is a fancy word of saying how the firm was engaging in complicated financial trading on long-term contracts. So, for example, let's say they landed a $100 million contract with the California government to supply electricity for the next 20 years or something. Over time, the electricity, it's going to change in price. There's going to be inflation. There's going to be moving variables. How much is this contract actually worth?
So you know that obviously $100 million is a shitload of money. You got to work out how do you account for it. What their system was saying, okay, let's make some projections. Today, this contract is worth this much money. So they mark it to market saying it's worth this today. When things change, that next month they're going to readjust it. Okay, maybe it's not worth 100 million. Maybe now it's worth 96 million. And then the next month was a good month. Oh, it's up to 102 million. So what they're doing is they're just trying to predict the future based on all the information at hand. And when things change, they adjust the price.
Yeah,
it's a pretty standard procedure. It's how you do it.
It's pretty dodgy. It's like saying I earned $1 million this year, projecting in my future cash flows and everything. Mate, I'm not a millionaire.
No, but I think it's a pretty standard way to do it. The confusion comes when you've got some cash and some paper. So if you say, hey, we made $10 million of profit, it could either mean that you've got $10 million of extra cash in the bank, or it could mean that you're expecting over the next 20 years that you're going to make $10 million. So it's a very big difference between cash, profits and paper profits.
Still dodgy, mate. It's a projection.
Well, what we've actually got, so in the second quarter of 2000, Enron said that we made $1 billion. But the difference here is that just a general no-name stock analyst, he looked a little bit deeper, read publicly available information, and he found that $747 million of that profit was unrealized, meaning that this was paper projections. When you take that out, they'd made a big cash loss, so they'd actually lost money, but they said, hey, we've made so much money because in the future we're going to get it. So that's using their mark-to-market system. It muddied the waters a little bit. All of the information was there. It just took a little bit more digging to find out the real answer.
Now, the prosecution said that Enron had hidden important truths, but everything this stock analyst learnt about the company had been through reading all the publicly available information. So they weren't withholding anything. All it took was just one hardcore stock analysis to run through it all and come up with the conclusions they did. Now, the next element that turned Enron into a mystery was its reliance on special purpose entities. Again, it sounds like a pretty effed up system, but it's one of those things that all your big corporations out there are doing. And what they do is if your company isn't looking healthy, a bank may not lend money directly to you because of your company. So they might charge an ridiculously high interest rate, so you're losing a lot of cash in the process. So what a company might do instead is they'll make all these sub-companies that, according to the bank, aren't linked to this original company, but they're borrowing money on their own accord. So despite this big company taking on all the money and investments and the risk, the banks don't see it that way. So they get a lower interest rate in the process.
Yeah, Gladwell says it's pretty commonplace in corporate America. It's a perfectly legal loophole to get better deals. It's legal. That doesn't necessarily mean it's moral. That's a different question. But Enron, even though you've got this one big company with 3,000 different long-term contracts, they broke those contracts up into 3,000 different special purpose entities. Now, each of these special purpose entities had over 1,000 pages of information about each one. So we're talking about a 3 million page document. Now, that's a shitload of information. It's all the information you could possibly need, but it's sort of like, okay, you've got all the pieces of the puzzle, but how do you actually analyze all of this information?
So you got 3,000 companies and the paperwork for each entity is over 1,000 pages. So we're looking at about 3 million pages to go through. So maybe you go for an edited version. So if a professor at Duke Law School, he actually did this and summarized each down to 40 pages each for a special purpose entity. So if they were to do it for Enron's case, still that's 120,000 pages of a highly paid professor doing it in 12-point single space font, which is
a shitload of pages still. Yeah.
And if you look at a summary about the summaries, this is exactly what the bankruptcy examiner did for Enron, and it was about 1,000 pages long, and that was with the benefit of hindsight. So what about the summary of the summaries of the summaries of the summaries? And you're still landing at about 200 ridiculously complicated pages, and it's only, as I said, pulled together with the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah, and again, this is actually what they had. So firstly, all 3 million pages are available. Then you got the professor who boiled it down to 120,000 pages. You got the bankruptcy examiner, boiled it down to 1,000 pages. You even had the auditing committee. They boiled it down to 200 pages. All of this stuff is there. All of the information is there. It's not like Enron's trying to hide everything. It's just like, man, there's so much information, what's relevant and what's not, and which of these 200 pages of complicated information actually matters to the position of the company.
So this wasn't a puzzle. A puzzle would have grown simpler by all the addition of new pieces of information. There we just had, 3 million pieces of information.
That's a lot of info.
And in an era where companies disclose everything and everything, the idea that our predictions and forecasts are better off with new information is totally wrong. We need more analysts like that hardcore wild man who actually went through it all. Would have taken him a while.
It certainly would have. So when you look at it, solving puzzles still remains critical in our world today. Like where's North Korea building their weapons? It's a puzzle with enough information you could find it. But when it comes to mysteries, they're increasingly taking center stage.
Puzzles, they're transmitter dependent. The solution is based on the information we're given from the other person. If you've locked up the terrorist or something, you just start chopping out their fingers and toes and boil water over their eyeballs and things like that, and all of a sudden you get information.
Mate, I'd hate to be tortured by you. You've got some sick shit in your brain.
Mate, it's all worth it. Utilitarian philosophy point of view, you just go through that just to get a bit of information. Mysteries, on the other hand, they're receiver dependent. It's not about how much information you get. It's about how you understand the information that's in front of you.
So with the Enron case, they gave out all the information you could ever possibly need. And in order to solve it, though, you need to analyze it in the right kind of way. So Enron never actually hid the truth. They made it clearly obvious all the things that they were doing. Maybe they were stretching the truth. They were doing their mark-to-market. They had their special purpose entities. Maybe it was a bit dodgy, but they weren't intentionally committing fraud because they told everybody exactly what they were doing.
So in the case of puzzles, we always blame the transmitter. We place the CEO in jail for 24 years and assume the work is done. But really it wasn't, what Malcolm's really saying, it wasn't really Jeffrey's fault here. He disclosed all the information, right? And it was on probably our system to catch him earlier through analysis.
Yeah.
I think if Gladwell was defending Skilling, I reckon he might have been half a shot. Maybe you'll pay Gladwell to come and do it because it's a pretty strong case he made.
Yeah, it certainly is. You're saying that mysteries require us to revisit the list of culprits, spread the blame a little more broadly. If you can't find the truth, if the prosecution can't find the actual truth of how to solve the mystery, then they're just as at fault as a person who is committing these atrocities. I guess if you look at it today, coronavirus, is that a puzzle or is that a mystery?
Oh, definitely a mystery.
It's a mystery. It's a mystery, isn't it?
And it does, if governments around the world, if they define it as a puzzle, they'll probably think, all right, we need to go out there and get more data, more testing, temperatures, all this kind of stuff. If you look at it as a mystery, everything looks different. All of a sudden, the solution is in how do we actually handle this thing. So the definition does have real-world implications.
We got a review from Jorge Bravo in Brazil. Great job, guys. You listen to the audio summary and decide if it's worth reading the book. 5 stars. Jorge Bravo, appreciate that. That is a pretty sweet name as well. We love getting these reviews. We love getting messages from people, whether that's a message on social media or an email or a contact us through the website or a review on the podcast. Just hearing that we're on the right track is very helpful to us and keeps us going and recording that next episode. So to anyone and everyone who leaves us a review or sends us a message or an email, thank you so much.